right. Official and formal good evening. We are getting underway with our study of First Samuel. A number of, well, not like we've got a huge class, I don't say a number of you, but two of you who were not here last week. In reviewing last week's video, did any of you have any questions that you wanted to bring up? We'll go ahead and put these on the record. So in case Emma, who's not able to be here this evening, might have had those same questions, but anything that came up in reviewing? Or yeah.
Nope.
All right. So, well, then moving forward, we are now into the section of First Samuel that kind of really hits its straps, where we're quickly moving along as David flees and Saul pursues. You can see how ragged Saul is becoming in his own mental state as the text continues, and that kind of will continue through the end of the book. And then we also see the development of David as a character. There are some things that will impress us about David during this time. There's also some question marks that we'll have to ask. And what we want to already have in the forefront of our mind is that we don't need to engage in the study of this text having already decided what it says. Because it's just like when you're reading in the book of Acts and you come to this really hairy section where Paul goes into the temple and offers to pay for the animal sacrifices of some guys who want to engage in ritualistic Mosaic cleansing. And it's like, if we've already decided that Paul is perfect, then that all seems okay. If we read it as it kind of is, and in light of the warnings that came before it and the outcomes that follow, we might read it differently. And the same thing is true of David. If we have already decided that he's a man after God's own heart, and really he only messes up with Uriah and Bathsheba, then we're going to kind of look at this and say, oh yeah, this is all okay. But I want to encourage us to continue to engage the text critically and realize that if the story of our own lives is fraught with imperfections, it's not surprising that when we examine others' lives, as the Holy Spirit allows us to do, that we see the same things. So let's just judge each case on its merits and then reflect upon it in light of the rest of inspiration, rather than on that one comment that stands out. With Paul, the one comment is, imitate me as I imitate Christ. With David, the one comment is that God had sought a man. He said he sought a man after his own heart. And so we, rather than allowing that one thing to become our guiding principle, simply realize that while there's a lot of praiseworthy things about both of these men, they're still men. All right, so let's get to 1 Samuel chapter 19. And Saul begins to actually now vocalize his desire to kill David, which Jonathan shares with David. Even after, mind you, Saul, speaks to Jonathan, his son, and to all the servants that they should kill David. Jonathan really has trouble embracing this truth. Jonathan is a good guy, but no one wants to believe their dad is crazy. And so when we get into chapter 20 and verse 2, we'll have to wrestle with the way that Jonathan kind of says what he says there. But at the very least, he had some awareness of what Saul was planning on doing, and he does pass that along to David. And so Jonathan manages at this time to calm Saul down, and David returns. And you kind of have this sort of yo-yo thing happening at this point, where maybe if you've ever tried to yo-yo with a cheap yo-yo before, you're playing with it and it comes back the first time, but then you try to keep doing it, and it seems like gradually it kind of loses its sort of inertia, and it doesn't get as close. And that's sort of the story of what will happen with David and Saul. They will come together and seemingly reconcile and then go apart, and then gradually they're getting further and further apart as the story will continue. So war though, sees David return to the battlefield and also to return to success. David fought the Philistines and struck them with a mighty blow, and they fled from him, which continues the story that has been so frustrating to Saul, of David, slaying his 10,000s and Saul his thousands, and all the while, the even though God's desire for these kings, just to again talk about general trends in the kings' lives, even though God's desire for the kings is to be, according to what we saw in the book of Deuteronomy, for these men to be students of the law and so on. If the judges are anything to go by, God does intend for when it's called for these men to be willing to stand up in defense of their nation and their people, God's people. When they send others on that task, it doesn't sit well with them because of the kind of men that they are. There's even though we saw Saul kind of shying away from leadership at first, there were natural qualities in there that we saw manifest early on in his kingship. And the same thing is true of David, although you could argue that the period of those natural qualities and those good qualities come to the fore is a longer period for David. When Saul starts sending other people out, that's when he kind of gets jealous and kind of loses his way. When David, makes his mistake, or let's say what it is, when he sins with Bathsheba, we find that it was the time when the text even identifies it's the time when the kings went out to battle, and meanwhile David is sitting on top of his rooftop. And so again, a lesson as to what can happen when we are not active participants in the war, so to speak. We'll never be able to fight for the Lord, by standing on the sidelines of the conflict, so to speak. So anyway,
Quick
David
question.
returns, successful from
Um,
battle. Yep. Sorry.
how long, at this point, do you know how long Saul has been king? How long since he was crowned?
Good question. If I remember right, Saul's total reign is 40 years. And we are definitely nearing the end of that. We are not in like the final year or anything. David is going to spend at least a year and a half in Philistia. And then prior to that, he is on the run for an undisclosed period of time. So, you're reading these texts like event, and it's not really touching base with the timeline throughout the text. So I would say we're in the 30s somewhere there in his reign, and definitely a lot of water's gone under the bridge at this point. So yeah, that'd be my guess though.
A lot of time to get comfy on the throne.
Right, right. Yeah, and that's what happens. Like I said, that the longer they stay on the throne, the more that they maybe feel for one reason or another they can't, or they lose that Caleb sense that we talked about earlier in our study, the give me this mountain kind of sense, and then leave the work to others, and then it doesn't go well with them either. In the case of David, pursuing adultery, or in the case of Saul, giving into jealousy. So
It's hard to retain humility as well, I imagine, when you've got that much power at your fingertips.
yeah, right. Yeah,
That's, yeah. I think we can see that with both men, as they go through that they think they're above the work that they used to do. That now that's, I've got people for that
yeah,
mentality, maybe.
yeah. It does. It kind of gets to that. Either uh, giving in to bad advice, or like as the saying goes, kind of drinking the bathwater or whatever. Just yeah, not remaining humble. There's something to said about both of these men, and how early on there's so much humility with Saul, and then even with David, when we see him kind of diffusing the situation with Saul. He's like, referring to himself as like a flea. What are you coming after a flea for? And so he's happy to put himself in an unflattering light. Whereas you don't necessarily see as much of that, unfortunately, in critical moments. I think there's a lot more. What keeps David on the path of faith is that in those sober-minded moments after failure, there is self-deprecation, and perhaps even too much. We'll talk about that when we get to his sin with Bathsheba in particular. But you do see appropriate remorse and realization of imperfection, in especially as the Psalms that are attributed to him and so on. So David's back. Anyway, again, going back to our story, and another chucking of the spear at David. You wonder how many spears Saul had. He's only pictured as having one later when he goes to the battlefield. But he certainly keeps it nearby and is more than happy to throw it at people, as we're going to find out later, including his own son. But anyway, at this point, he's not really that accurate. Doesn't hit David. David goes home at this point, and he's pursued, by assassins that Saul has sent, who have a plan to kill him in the morning. And his wife, which is who remembers who she is?
Daughter of the man trying to kill him.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, Michal or Michael or whatever however you want to say her name. She actually helps him to get away. She buys David some time through deceit. She claims to the messengers that Saul has sent that he's sick, and they're like, they are told to go back and get him. And then when they go and try to get him, there's an image in the bed with a cover of goat's hair for his head. There's a question about that image in the bed. Like typically, of the probably times when this I wouldn't say typically, but because I haven't actually looked to see one way or the other, to be honest. There are many times where the term image does reference some kind of idolatry, or something. And we're certainly going to wonder a bit about this woman and her heart. There's an episode that will happen later in her life where she is ashamed at the behavior of David and his excitement over the return of the ark to the tabernacle, and just and his praise and worship to the Lord. So we'll talk about that too in the future. But anyway, she also, in addition to lying about his about his whereabouts and being sick and all this, she also lies about David's behavior. Saul says to Michal, "Why have you deceived me like this and sent my enemy away so that he has escaped?" And she answers and says, "He said to me, 'Let me go. Why should I kill you?'" And so I was trying to hold him, Dad, but he just forced himself away. And so again, painting herself in a more favorable light. Well, asking the question, this isn't the best example of it because, like I said, there's already question marks over this woman. But we'll be asking the question later. Is this kind of behavior justifiable? I think probably a more appropriate place to have this discussion, in particular, lying to save your skin kind of thing. We're going to see David engage in the same thing when he is with the Philistines during his kind of period in sort of exile after running away from Saul. So we'll talk about that in the future, but we'll plant the seed for that conversation. Anyway, David finds Samuel and tells him about what has happened. When Saul finds out, he sends troops who are kept from their purpose by God leading them to prophesy of all things. So the messengers, it says, they come, and the Spirit of God came upon the messengers of Saul, and they also prophesied, just like Samuel was doing, along with this group of prophets in verse 20. And so Saul finds out about this. He sends the messengers a third time. They prophesied also. He does it again and again, three times in total, sending messengers. Then he goes, and it says, he says, "Where are Samuel and David?" And he goes further to try to pursue him. And then he ends up prophesying. And so this is an interesting reading. I don't know that we have any more details than what we see here, but the question might be asked by some. It might even be in your mind. How can wicked men prophesy? We know Saul's not doing the right thing. Maybe the messengers are just operating under orders, but none of these men are actively pursuing God. So how is it that they come to prophesy?
I mean, you can see through scripture that it's not always the most religious or devout men who God uses to prophesy.
Yeah.
It's also interesting. Oh.
Yeah. And speaking of, well, let's see what you have to say, and then I'll maybe add
It's
something to
interesting.
that.
This is a very different sort of prophesying than we usually see. Because normally the purpose of a prophecy recorded in the scriptures is for a message to be handed on from God and for us to be enlightened in some way, or, the original recipients as well, be enlightened by that message from God. Here it seems almost a source of confusion or, stopping them from doing what they're trying to do. Saul seems almost I hesitate to use the word possessed, but right, he doesn't seem to be able to do what he does. He strips off his clothes. He sounds like he passes out naked here, or at least, lays down naked. And it's, and we're not told anything about the at least as far as my quick skim here,
Yeah.
about the real content of the prophecy.
Well,
So
we'll pause about I should point out, we'll pause about the biblical idea of being naked. Being naked,
underclothes, perhaps. Yeah.
yeah. It doesn't necessarily mean that we've got a nude man, spouting off the word of God, but rather that he has taken off his normal attire. I kind of liken this to and by the way, I've noticed that newer translations are sometimes like they don't like the fact that this is there, and so they just translate it away. But in John 21, the Bible actually says that the Greek says that Peter was naked while he was out there fishing. And then the funny thing is that he puts on his jacket to dive in the water to go see Jesus. But there's very little chance that Peter was literally in the nude as he was fishing. Like that's not something people do. And even
You
in
do
terms
see
of
all over the world. You do see, like, in many, many different cultures, that men at work, especially, kind of lower class, less wealthy men who are doing this sort of menial labor, would
yeah,
often, be in a loincloth, because every civilization ever has invented the loincloth, of
yeah.
some sort, because you have, maybe one set of clothes if you're lucky, and you're not going to get it dirty or ripped up from your physical labor job. So, you
Yeah,
see that a lot
we have a
everywhere.
decent read on at least, not that I've given great research into the picture, but given things like the crucifixion, the description of Jesus' parts to his garment, we have a pretty good read on the way the Jews dressed themselves in that period of time, at least as far as what I've heard, without having really dug into it personally. But like more than likely he's wearing what's like a tunic, like an inner kind of like a big t-shirt, kind of thing. And so they in this particular time, in this particular place, the Jews would dress in layers, more so than having that, kind of loinclothy kind of thing like you're talking about. I mean, it's not beyond him adopting some kind of dress that would be more in keeping with the Gentile world, but maybe not, also. So it's just that the word naked is kind of tossed around in scripture in ways that we probably wouldn't apply it, is all that I'm saying with this. So anyway,
They would consider half the people walking down the street in summer to be naked
yeah, absolutely,
by their
absolutely,
standards.
yeah, yeah. Um, so so going back to what Chloe said though about the God kind of having a track record of not always using perfect individuals for this purpose. And we'll address what you've added there, Nicholas. But the what is prophecy in its core sense? The word stems from a Hebrew word which means to bubble forth, and so it is to operate under the influence of another source of inspiration other than your own. Now that can happen to anyone, or significantly anything. There's a case in the Old Testament, of course, of a certain donkey belonging to Balaam that was able to spout off effectively prophecy. He was, given inspiration and able to discern the moment and describe the moment better than Balaam himself was able to do. And so as far as relates to, why don't we know the content of the message? Well, maybe we do. Maybe the content of the message, even though it's not revealed for us in the record, maybe the content of the message is implied relative to what has been a consistent message up until this point. More of the message that Saul needs to hear about his own kingdom coming to an end and the Lord's intentions for establishing a kingdom in David. If I were to speculate the content of the message, I would say it's something along those lines. Now, to get to the point, is this a kind of God fueled like mania? And I'm going to shy away from looking at it that way. I know that things can happen in the Old Testament that are separate and apart from what happens in the New. I know that, and yet I wonder if when Paul talks about the gift of prophecy, if something very different would have happened when people in the previous dispensation uttered prophecy. So in 1 Corinthians 14:32, the Bible says that the spirit of the prophets are subject to the prophets, meaning that when New Testament individuals with the gift of prophecy, when they were engaging in their prophetic work, they never did so kind of as robots or as Balaam's donkey delivered his prophecy. Like Balaam's donkey can't talk and he doesn't have a personality, and so effectively Balaam's donkey serving as a puppet. But I think that Paul's words can be understood as that prophets don't serve as puppets. Their own spirits remain subject to them even as they engage in the work of prophecy. And that's why he gives instructions relative to their behavior in the text that surround that, the verses that surround that text. So how is it that prophecy then becomes any kind of a brakes to someone wanting to do something? And well, I wonder if maybe Jeremiah's own thoughts have anything to say about that. So while the spirit of the prophet is subject to the prophet, what happened when Jeremiah determined that he was not going to speak anymore on behalf of God? Jeremiah chapter 20, verse 9 says that his word was in his heart like a burning fire, and he was weary with trying to hold back, and he couldn't stop. And so maybe, you've probably had that feeling before of being antsy, and maybe the effect of inspiration on someone is something like that. You're not out of control when you're antsy, but you really feel like you need to do something. And maybe that feeling is so insistent that people, typically give into it, including those who are very motivated not to do so, like Saul. So, or even like Jeremiah said he was. He said, I determined not to do this anymore, but then he did it anyway. So anyway, that's my best guess. And you're welcome to kind of think about that more if you'd like, or even dispute that. I mean, that's just what do you think?
Never really thought about it that way.
All right.
I don't know.
Yeah, you don't have to. And I don't know that like I said, we're not given a whole lot of information here. But I tend in my mind, when I think about the way that God influences people, to draw a clear line of distinction between what God will do and what Satan will do. God, in my opinion, and based upon my understanding, will not override a person's individuality or his free will. God never renders a person, through his influence as being incapable of doing what he would desire. In other words, God doesn't turn a man into a puppet, is what really I'm trying to say. I know that God, in his judgment, can strike people dead, and all those kinds of things can happen, but not remove in him his divine image. Whereas when Satan kind of has the steering wheel, so to speak, when he's given the opportunity to influence someone, that's where you find through his minions or servants, whatever you want to call them, that's when you find people like being totally taken over and their personality being lost, or or severely, like in the case of the slave girl, like in Acts 16, severe, the personality being severely depressed, to where that person really isn't their person anymore. So anyway, things you think about. Moving on. In 1 Samuel 20, like I said, we come to this Jonathan's warning. Previously, Jonathan did become aware of Saul wanting to kill David, but Jonathan at least says to David at this point, "I can't believe my father would hide this from me. By no means, you shall not die," he says. "Indeed, my father will do nothing, either great or small, without first telling me." And so maybe, Jonathan, in his own mind, to try to figure out what's going on here, maybe he's like, Saul's like, "I'll kill him," and like Jonathan differentiates that from, "Here is my plan to kill him." I don't know. I don't know why he says that, having had the experience that we see recorded in chapter 19, verse 1. But David believes Saul has simply been hiding this because he knows about their friendship. And so, of course, Saul's going to be a little bit more guarded in talking to his son, which which he's right about that. Saul does know about his Jonathan's relationship with David, and the two of them being friends. I do like the little one-liners that can be kind of lifted from their context throughout the historical books. And so I'll just step aside and look at this little statement that David makes, where he says, "There is but a step between me and death." And what an appropriate description, not just of David, but really of any one of us. There's always a step between us and death, and it's really a sobering thought when you think about it that way. But as much as I'd like to spend reflecting on that sobering thought, we'll move forward. Jonathan pledges to help David, and David reveals a plan to determine Saul's intentions. And so he says, "I'm going to miss this upcoming new moon feast." Apparently, the new moon was important in the calendar of the Jews, both religiously and socially. He has a regular meal that all of his kind of people are meant to come to. Saul does, in other words. And so David's not going to show up for this. And so is he going to be upset about it? Well, David then, you see this constant willingness, to die throughout David's words. "If I've done anything wrong, just kill me, and but you do it. Don't let your dad do it." And Jonathan says, "No, that's not what's going on." So that kind of goes back and forth a bit. David, though, will be informed of the outcome of the meal within 3 days. And so we're going to give this 3 days. We'll see what Saul does during that time. Sensing perhaps a very different future, or maybe being aware of prophecy, given that we've had Saul and these messengers all doing some prophesying, what does Jonathan know at this point? How does he know it? Well, chapter 20 and verse 14, he says, "You shall not Only show me the kindness of the Lord while I still live, that I may not die. But you shall not cut off your kindness from my house forever. No, not when the Lord has cut off every one of the enemies of David from the face of the earth. How does he know anything about that? Somehow. We don't know how, but there's been ample opportunity for him to have discovered that one way or the other. The two made a covenant once in chapter 20 and verse 16, and then again with the story and revealing in verse 17, that having made a covenant or having vowed with each other, they did so because, Jonathan says, because he loved him, for he loved him as he loved his own soul. Now, we'll just take a little step aside here to note that unfortunately, David's and Jonathan's relationship gets kind of reinterpreted by those wearing 21st century glasses, with some implying that a homosexual relationship exists between them. Now, what do we know about the law of Moses and homosexuality?
No can do.
Yeah, thou shalt not lie with mankind as with womankind. It is abomination. It's just, it's just a very blunt message in the law of Moses. Just wrong, don't do it. And not only do you have the wrong, don't do it message, you have, the account, which, also gets kind of reinterpreted by those 21st century glasses, the account of Lot and the angels and the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah and so on, which, rightfully to agree, is a term that's coined in our language, to describe a certain sexual orientation. So again, the problem in reading this text is we've given opportunity, unfortunately, for the 21st century misinterpretation of the text by a 20th century disposition that's also not a good thing. So as much as I want to be a champion of masculinity, and I know that most conservative-minded people, they want to be that, we have to acknowledge that there has been, probably in a lot of our experiences, perhaps, at least in mine for sure, sort of, as to borrow the term from my liberally minded friends, a toxic masculinity that has been, kind of upheld as though it were biblical masculinity. When you read the kind of letters that men wrote each other, who were clearly, in every other historical portrayal of them, clearly heterosexual men, when you see the way that they used to talk to each other in their personal correspondence, you see a whole lot more tenderness and affection. And it clearly used to be understood that, that just because a man loves another man doesn't mean that has to be a sexual love. And so we really need to, if we're going to kind of fight the 21st century interpretation, perhaps we do need to do a little bit of examination to, what's been upheld as masculinity for too long, unfortunately, and see that, there's nothing wrong. Like even in the book of Genesis, you have Jacob and you have Esau. You have Esau, the hairy, hunting, going out there man, and then you have Jacob that dwells by the tents, and implication, he doesn't like to hunt. He doesn't like doing the things that so often the men do, and so it's just that we need to allow what it is to be a man to be a more dynamic concept, and that way we can defend what it is, what masculinity really is, and not allow these kind of pictures to get appropriated by people who are trying to tear apart the Bible in every way. So anyway, I don't know if you've seen any of that or thought about it, but certainly something that I've seen happen. I wanted you to be aware of.
There's also the kind of flattening out and shallowing of love. You know, I
Yeah.
think that's one of the reasons why there's such a cultural fixation on weird sex stuff, right?
Mm.
With the rainbows and the trans and everything, is because everything has to be about sex. Everything has to be
Yeah.
about, anything about love has to be that,
Right.
right? And so it's when you have a really shallow view of what love is constituted of, then you then paint with an overly broad brush, in too few colors and end up with a warped picture.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, which
Yeah.
obviously we're dealing, with a much more complex and deep thing. I mean, how many
Yeah.
sermons have you heard about on the different types of love?
Yeah.
The words for love in the New Testament, right?
Yeah.
And it feels like it's, yeah, simplifying in a way that's not healthy or good for us at this point.
Yeah, it really is. And you talked about, painting with too broad a brush and all of that. It's interesting that someone just mentioned here tonight that the original pride flag is missing one of the colors of the rainbow. And like there's 6 colors in it as opposed to the 7 that are in the true rainbow. And that's the problem with today's world. If you're not painting with all the colors, you'll never get an accurate picture, so to speak, to mingle our metaphors there. But yeah, yeah, I think that, yeah, we don't want to fall prey. We don't want to be baited in defending false masculinity. We want to allow love to be a dynamic concept, and to allow love to be something that doesn't have to be mingled with sin, not sin, with sexuality all the time. Because sexuality doesn't always have to be sinful, but and again, it can be. All
Or do
right.
they love it?
Yeah. So evidently, not knowing if he can trust even his servants, Jonathan states that he's going to reveal the outcome of the meal through some archery practice and how he commands his servant to retrieve the arrows. And so he concocts this plan about what he will say after he shoots some arrows to his servant to indicate that David is either free to come back or he needs to run. Saul doesn't openly question David's absence or show any anger on day one. He actually says he is not clean, meaning what? What do you think he means when he says in verse 26, he's not clean?
He's hasn't bathed.
No, not that. So no, no one is super worried about taking baths in the ancient world.
Ritually clean seems to
Yeah,
be
he must be ritually unclean because
stay outside the camp.
yeah, there has to there with ritual or ceremonial uncleanness. There are times where you have to not be around people, and so he's dismissing David's absence on that basis on day one. But day two, he's like, something's gone wrong here. Jonathan, where is he? And Jonathan responds, well, he's gone to Bethlehem. He asked to be able to go and spend this time with his family, and begged to be able to do that. And Saul is furious and says in verse 30, you son of a perverse, rebellious woman, do I not know that you have chosen the son of Jesse to your own shame and to the shame of your mother's nakedness? Now, there's another odd expression, but to the shame of your mother's nakedness is clearly some kind of idiom, and it's a deep shame is all these thoughts. You've done something that's truly deeply shameful, Jonathan, by aligning yourself with David. And you can see again how they thought about clothing or the lack of it in this time. So Jonathan asked why David deserved to die. And at that point, Saul's heard enough, and he cast a spear at his own son, just like he had done to David. And Jonathan's like, "Yep, Dad wants to kill this guy." Question that we'll briefly ask, and then unfortunately have to move on from is who else is hurt when we hate? So often there's collateral damage when we hold grudges in our hearts, and so often the feelings of ill that we store up for others, we end up showering upon people that don't deserve it at all. Now, David, granted, doesn't deserve anything that Saul is feeling towards him at this point. But Jonathan, if anybody really, really doesn't deserve it, it would be him. And yet he gets a spear thrown at him. So who else is hurt when we hate? Jonathan, though, leaves and gives David the appointed warning. He manages, though, to send the servant away so that they can say goodbye from one another. This won't be the last time that they see each other, but the circumstances have now clearly changed. All right. So chapter 21 begins David on the run now. And there are the number of episodes that the text will record during this time where he is fleeing, and we're leading up to the time, obviously, when Saul is going to lose his throne and lose his life. But it's not going to happen on the through the hands of David, as we're going to see over and over again. Before the two encounter each other, though, David runs by way of, what's the name of that city? Can't remember, but he passes by where the tabernacle is, and he encounters Ahimelech, who is a priest, and the priest says, "Why are you alone?" Now, he's not alone. He's got people with him, but why are you not with other soldiers? The people that he's leading around are clearly servants or young men. So why isn't he with Saul or some others? And so David says, and the priest had previously worked in conjunction with Saul, so they would be used to seeing who traveled with who and so on, or with whom. David claims to be on business and asks for bread, on the king's business, and asks for bread. He says, ask for 5 loaves of bread or whatever can be found. In verse 3, Ahimelech states that there is only holy bread, which he would consider giving them if the young men have recently been abstinent, have they kept themselves from women. And so David, that they're aware of, and David is aware of, purity and its emphasis during times of war. Deuteronomy 23, 9 through 14 talks about the importance of purity in the camp of, the Israelites. And so did that extend to not, having any time with even a legitimate spouse? Uriah, if you think about kind of fast forward the tape a little bit, when Uriah's on leave during a time of war, he refuses to go home. And that might be at least the reason that's stated is his allegiance to the soldiers in the battlefield, but maybe there was a deeper thing happening there. In any event, it's hard to kind of understand all of where the priest is coming from, and even all of David's response. But effectively, he says that this is, even though this has been an ordinary journey, not a war march or going to war kind of thing, he believes they've all been pure, and maybe there's something to this being a new moon period and all of that. So New King James kind of butchers verse number 5 in following the King James there. So just note English Standard Version, New American Standard Version probably have the better grasp on what he's saying there. So the priests gave him the showbread and then also Goliath's sword. Meanwhile, Doeg the Edomite is watching all of this, and he'll come up in a little bit. Before that, though, let's ask the question about what we've just seen with David and the showbread. So, as we think about what the showbread is supposed to be and what it's supposed to mean, it's bread that is set before the Lord and offering to him, which is then, after it has been offered to him, it is then repurposed and it becomes a part of the food with which the priests sustain themselves. So it's offered to God, and then God returns it to the priests, and it's a holy thing. It's not supposed to be, taken and given to soldiers, David or anyone. So the question is, well, what do we make of this? And the reason that this question gets asked with a little bit more urgency is because this actually gets revisited during the ministry of Jesus. So let's let's maybe go ahead and read Matthew 12, verses 1 through 8. If someone can read that for us, please.
Matthew 12, 1 through 8. At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry, and they began to pluck heads of grain and to eat. But when the Pharisees saw it, they said to him, "Look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath." He said to them, "Have you not read what David did when he was hungry, and those who were with him? How he entered the house of God and ate the bread of the presence, which it was not lawful for him to eat, nor for those who were with him, but only for the priests. Or you have not read in the law how on the Sabbath the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are guiltless. I tell you, something greater than the temple is here. And if you had known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless, for the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath."
Right. So, what is happening, in this reading, and what's happening in the account which it references here with David? So, there's a couple of different lines of reasoning on, on this whole thing. On the one hand, there are some who say, yes, God approves of this, because, the rules get bent when life gets in the way. And that's kind of the understanding of some as relates to, the Lord's commandments and holiness and Sabbath and all that kind of stuff. It's, we have this kind of coming out in Jesus elsewhere. And I think sometimes the wires get a little bit crossed, at least in my opinion, what's happening here. We see, Jesus saying things like, what about the ox in the ditch on the Sabbath? What about, why is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath? And there's all these different Sabbath episodes throughout the ministry of Jesus that we all kind of lump into one big category. And so when we hear Jesus answering here from that point of view, we hear David, getting brought up here as him saying, well, David was really okay when he did this, and the priests are really okay when they do what they do. My disciples are really okay in doing what they do, and all of this is because God really wants mercy and not sacrifice. And that you guys need to think about the principle of life and people needing to live. That's how some read the text. But I'm going to argue, and I'll give you a chance to rebuttal in a minute here if you'd like, but I'm going to argue that no, that's not the case. In fact, I want to highlight a couple of things about this reading in Matthew 12. One, the disciples are picking grain to eat on the Sabbath day. What is unlawful on the Sabbath day? Is it unlawful to eat, or is it unlawful to work?
Work.
Yeah, right. So it's unlawful to work, and their picking of the grain is incidental, in as much as they are merely taking the grain and putting it in their mouth. They're eating. Just because the Pharisees have looked on this and declared them to be not lawful doesn't mean that they are right interpreters of the law in so doing. And if anything, the later words of Jesus, that they are the guiltless, would be the way that we would view the disciples' behavior. So that's the first part of the equation for me. So the disciples are declared by Jesus to be the guiltless. So then part two is, what is he doing when he brings up these examples? I think what he's doing is demonstrating that the Pharisees don't really know the Sabbath as well as they think they do, nor do they know the scriptures as well as they think they do. How often, when Jesus is kind of rebutting his opponents, does he ask the question, have you not read? In this case, he's aware that they know the account, and so he's saying, have you not considered? The typical way that Jews kind of viewed their history was with rose-colored glasses. We do the same thing with Paul that they did with David. And they would look at David in this account and say, he was okay in doing that. But when Jesus evaluates that, again, if you just take him at his words, he says, it was not lawful for him to eat. So whereas he has declared his own disciples to be guiltless, he has said of the priests that of David, that what he did was not lawful. Right. So that's part two. Then the third part obviously is, what about the priests, active on the Sabbath? So on the one hand, while he says they haven't, they're not judging David for worse for wrong behavior, they're also not processing the fact that on the Sabbath, things need to still happen. And so that's the other part of their misunderstanding of what the disciples are doing. The disciples have to eat because people eat. The priests have to do something because they're required to do things in worship to their God. There's a difference between what is truly necessary and what is ultimately not. And it's not merely on the basis of hunger, right? Again, that's the way that I view it. And to borrow a quote from a voice from yesteryear, I remember reading this in J.W. McGarvey's commentary, and I brought it up here as just a good summation of this discussion, in my opinion. Again, Jesus expressly admits that what David did was unlawful. And some have supposed that he here intends to justify it on the ground of necessity, and then to argue that his disciples, though guilty of violating the law of the Sabbath, are justifiable on the same ground. David's okay, my disciples are okay. That's how some read it. But it cannot be that he who refused to turn stones into bread when tortured by a 40 days fast, and who said, "Whosoever shall break one of these least commandments and teach men shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven," would approve of such a violation of the law as David was guilty of. If Christians may violate law when its observance would involve hardship or suffering, then there is an end of suffering for the name of Christ and an end even of self-denial. And I like the way that he's kind of followed. I like when I'm evaluating something to follow the train tracks. If hunger justifies us for behavior, unlawful behavior to satisfy our hunger, then where does that train stop? Why did it stop for Jesus when it came down to being tempted to turn the stones into bread? Why would it stop me from David takes the holy bread? What if I go into a store and rob the store in hunger? And what if I continue in that lifestyle of perpetually doing so? Wouldn't that be called and rightfully so, like robbery, like thievery, and wouldn't I be guilty of sin in so doing? So, anyway, that's the way that my brain has kind of worked through this. You can feel free to argue on the other side if you'd like.
There's a weird extra twist in here that the priest who is in charge of the showbread also seems to think that given certain, tick boxes here, that
right.
we have no idea, where he comes up with those qualifications. That's what I was looking for. Where he comes up with that qualification, but he seems to think that if the men meet this qualification, then all right, I suppose so.
Yeah.
Which is then also a thing. And so is Daniel just then, acquiescing to his authority on the subject, that surely the priest of God at the tabernacle who's in charge of the showbread would know the best thing to do with it? Does he know better and go along with it anyway? And so then it is definitely, sin there. Well, it is a bit of a tricky one.
I'm not prepared to comment on whether this is a presumptuous sin or a sin in ignorance. I'm just asking the question: is it sin? Because you're right in thinking that David might have been willing to go along with an interpretation, and honestly, I think the same thing happens with Paul in the temple. Paul goes along with the elders' advice. He follows the elders' advice, and again, why wouldn't you? Unless again, you might be aware that there's an issue with that eldership a little bit. It's not without reason that Galatians 2 points out that certain came from James, James being one of the elders there, and all of a sudden Peter's not eating with the Gentiles anymore. Barnabas gets carried away in the hypocrisy. It's like there's something a little bit fishy about what's going on, unfortunately, with the elders at that point. But anyway, and there might be something very well fishy going on here with Ahimelech. I mean, we're not very far removed from Hophni, Phinehas, and carrying the ark into the battlefield. There's all kinds of ways that people justify things, and so I'm not going to comment on why he makes this kind of, like, well, if you stayed away from women, then I'll give it to you. I don't know about that part. But I think a straightforward reading of Jesus and him simply saying that it's unlawful is kind of enough for me to say it's unlawful. All right. Well, you can mull that one over. And there are moments like that where that's kind of what you have to do. But moving forward, David goes for the first time in our record to the territory of Achish, the king of Gath, which is one of the cities of the Philistines. And when Achish's servants talk about David's reputation as being someone who's killed a lot of Philistines, David decides that it's time to pretend that he is insane, which lowers Achish's guard. And he's like, "Why did you bring me this guy? I don't need another crazy guy around here." And that's kind of where that wraps up. But at this point, David doesn't feel as though there's a need or maybe even ability at this point to keep staying with the Philistines, and so he ends up leaving. Any questions, comments on chapter 21? All right. Good time to maybe take a break, and we'll do that, and we'll come back in a little bit. Welcome back. We are going to pick back up with 1 Samuel 22, and David, this continued story of David on the run. So David's, decides, of course, that he's not going to stay in Philistia, but we're going to see in this chapter how his following grows and how Saul responds to the help that Ahimelech has unwittingly extended to David and his crew. So anyway, first couple of verses, David leaves Gath and he meets up with his family. All the while, he draws a following of what I'll call misfits and malcontents. The text says in verse 2, everyone who's in distress, everyone who's in debt, everyone who was discontented gathered to him. Who does that remind you of?
Oh, isn't that the Levite and his concubine?
No. It
It
might
reminds me of
remind you of
Jesus.
that. It didn't remind me of that. I can't say no. I asked who it reminded you of. So if that reminds you of that, that's fine, Joey. But what did you say,
Like,
Chloe?
It
I'd
says,
say it reminds me of Jesus.
Yeah, it reminds me of Jesus. Let's go
all
with
right,
that
yeah.
one. These are the people that so often find their way into Jesus's group of disciples. These people who are rejected by others, and so it's not without reason that Jesus is so often identified as the son of David, both by lineage and then sometimes by behavior. Anyway, these men, even though they have a variety of backgrounds, they don't stay the kind of men that they were before. We see David repurposing and or maybe giving purpose to men who otherwise had lost their purpose. And that, in a nutshell, is what Jesus does for people. He gives them, he teaches them about their true purpose and helps to restore them to that purpose. But David seeks refuge among the Moabites. It's interesting how he's able to move. I'm guessing that people can see or maybe have heard that Saul is after David, and so that's why these people who later on are going to end up being David's enemies are at this point at least willing to give him a chance. The enemy of my enemy is my friend, as the saying goes. But the Moabites are willing to shelter him for a period until the prophet Gad comes and says, "This isn't where God wants you to be." And so David departs and goes back into Judean territory. Well, while this is happening, Saul learns that David has been found. And so the prophet Gad going to him, others knew where he was, and this leads him to, in his paranoia, start threatening his servants. He's like, "Hear now, you Benjamites, will the son of Jesse give every one of you fields and vineyards and make you captains of thousands, captains of hundreds? You think life will be a whole lot better under David," is what he's saying there. "And all of you have conspired against me, and there's no one who reveals to me that my son has made a covenant with the son of Jesse. How come none of you told me about these two, my son having David as a friend?" And there is not one of you who is sorry for me or reveals to me that my son has stirred up my servant against me to lie in wait as it is this day. Jonathan isn't on the run here, and so you kind of, even though he doesn't seem to be, kind of going along with Saul, excuse me, when he's chasing David, it's like, wow, it's really not making life easy for anyone at this point. But there is somebody who's there. Remember, we said that we're going to bring up Doeg the Edomite later on, and here he is.
Yeah, that traitor.
Yeah, Doeg. Well, he's an Edomite, so although he seems to have had some business at the temple, I don't want to fall into that habit again. Tabernacle. He seems to have had some business at the tabernacle. Doeg the Edomite is clearly up to no good. He reveals that what he saw, how Ahimelech had given David the bread, and all that had happened there, and not just the bread, but probably what seemed inflammatory. What has seemed more inflammatory to Saul, perhaps, is the passing over of Goliath's sword. So anyway, Saul goes to Ahimelech and accuses him of helping David, and this surprises Ahimelech. He didn't even know there was an issue with David, and he's like, I didn't do anything else. I gave him, it's what you said is true. I gave him the sword and gave him the bread, but your servant knew nothing of all this. He says at the close of verse 15, little or much. I just didn't know what was going on. But that's not good enough for Saul, who at this point orders Ahimelech's death along with his family, which, of course, the servants refuse to do. I'm really glad to see that, given where we've been in Israelite history, that there is at least some kind of respect for what's happening at the tabernacle at this point. And that they are unwilling to do this, but who is willing to do this? Saul turns to, Doeg the Edomite, and says, "I'll do it, and you turn and kill the priest." And so Doeg the Edomite turns and struck the priests. Whatever business he might have had being at the tabernacle previously clearly was not worth more to him than the opportunity to impress Saul, and so he kills not just the instruction was to kill Ahimelech and his family, but when he says that's the initial instruction, now he says kill the priest, and Doeg takes that quite literally and kills all of the priests that he can get his hands on, 85 priests to be exact. And not only that, but once he starts killing people, he doesn't stop. And he attacks the city of Nob, where the tabernacle was situated, and strikes, it says here, both men and women, children and nursing infants, oxen and donkeys, and sheep with the edge of the sword. Now, what does that sound like? That sounds like what Saul was supposed to do with the Amalekites. Remember, Saul was supposed to utterly destroy the Amalekites. And so, whether those details are just details to be included, or whether there's, an interesting play on what happens, how Doeg the Edomite, not the Israelite, is more seemingly willing to obey the word of his Lord Saul than Saul was willing to obey the word of the Lord when he had the chance. Well, one of the priests escapes to tell David. Thankfully, that happens, by the way, because even though the term high priest isn't used to describe Ahimelech, there are some, and that term is used to describe the guy in 1 Samuel 14. Or at least he's identified as that man wearing the ephod and all that. Ahijah. There's people who actually think that Ahijah and Ahimelech might be the same person, or they might be brothers. But they seem to be from the current high priestly family. And there's some people who understand the word priest in this chapter as being the high priest. And so it's really good that somebody survived, to make a long story short. But this survival, even though it's going to, and all of this kind of plays into what God is doing here, because we're going to see David having the ability to contact God, which is going to set up a contrast for Saul, who can no longer do that. But right now, though, David gets filled with guilt and a desire to protect this survivor. The statement that he makes there is worth pausing and considering. Verse 22, I have caused the death of all the persons of your father's house. He says, I caused it because he saw Doeg the Edomite. He knew what he was going to do, but he didn't do anything about it. I have caused the death. What do you think about that?
He seems to kind of be blaming himself.
Definitely
Yeah, that's what
blaming
he
himself.
is doing. Is it warranted?
I mean, what comes to my mind immediately is what would he have done otherwise, right? Would he have seen Doeg and just struck him down where he stands on suspicion?
Yeah, right. Exactly.
Because that seems like an extreme move. Of course, when you hear about the mass slaughter, you might think, "Oh, I should have done that," right? In that emotional moment. But yeah, it's what would he have done differently? Because presumably by the time he sees Doeg, Doeg has seen him.
Yeah.
Maybe just have turned around immediately. When did that happen? Was he already talking with the priest before that? I don't know. It's enough anyway for him to
Yeah.
be feeling
There's
something.
there's something about David that sees him weirdly attributing guilt. There's times when you're like, David, didn't you feel anything? Why didn't you do anything? And then there's other times where you're like, David, man, that wasn't your fault. And I think that's probably true of a lot of us, that we can do that, be guilty of on the one hand total inactivity when there really ought to be something, and then on the other hand, just owning something that we have no ability or not had no ability to affect or change or do anything about. So really, if he were to have struck Doeg down out of suspicion, who would he not be like in doing that?
Sorry, that sentence
It's
might
very
have one too
open-ended, I'm
many
aware.
negatives in it.
Yeah. So
Uh,
so to strike him down, yeah, well, I mean, there's only one negative. Who would he not be
Okay.
like? And I know that's a very open-ended question. There's a lot of people that he wouldn't be like, but what supreme being of the universe doesn't strike
Jesus.
people down on the basis of what they will do in the future? You're right,
Jesus.
Jesus, and even to the point where, Jesus is willing to invite into his closest companionship a man that he knows is in the future going to betray him. The thing is, he hasn't betrayed him yet, and until the up and to the point that Judas betrayed him, he was looking at him as though he were a friend. Even in the garden, as Judas is leaning in for the kiss, friend, why have you come? And so God judges our behavior, and although thought can be sin, not he doesn't view us with suspicion prior to the effect, even with his foreknowledge. Well, anyway,
Also, a lot of what we're seeing negative from Saul right now is paranoid aggression, right? That so while Daniel, might have wished he was more paranoid in this moment when he's taking the blame that he had done something quicker. What we see is that he doesn't do that sort of thing. He's not just lashing out like Saul is.
Yeah. And as a man who says tabernacle, or who says temple when he means tabernacle all the time, you're saying Daniel when you mean David. You've done that twice.
Yeah. I've been doing that in my notes all night as well. I keep having to scratch out and right.
Daniel.
I just did a 3-part series on Daniel, and I can't begin writing DA without finishing, NIEL.
I hear you, man. It's tough. Well, anyway, David, getting into chapter 23, David learns that Keilah is being pillaged by the Philistines, and so after inquiring from the Lord, he decides to intervene. Note a purposeful contrast. I don't know that we're always told when David inquires from the Lord after this point. I think this chapter is kind of setting up an indication of how David is operating typically. Although, again, we're going to be presented with some moral difficulty in David's behavior in a little bit. But anyway, at this point, David is asking God, what do I do? And God says, effectively go and attack the Philistines and save Keilah. Well, he inquires, he does inquire from the Lord again when his men are uncertain about this whole thing. And, the Lord adds, I will deliver the Philistines into your hand. You're going to be successful. So don't just go and attack and save, go and you'll be delivered. Or rather, they'll be delivered into your hands, to use the language of the text. David then goes, he repels the Philistines, and possibly to explain how David does this inquiring of the Lord, and certainly a setup for what's going to happen later in the chapter. It's noted that Abimelech's son Abiathar is the priest who ran to David, and he happened to have an ephod, which, as we know, the ephod contains the Urim and the Thummim, which allows them to basically ask those yes and no questions of God. And so really that might be how he's inquiring of God. All right, so Saul learns that David is in Keilah, prepares to bring his forces against him there. David learns about this, and after inquiring of the Lord yet again, he discovers that the inhabitants of Keilah will betray him to save themselves. Given where Saul is at, and people do often act out of self-preservation rather than altruistically, even for someone who has clearly done something so good for them and saving them. But to avoid all of that, David leaves, and he goes into the wilderness of Ziph, which is those Ziphites are not going to be his friends, as we're going to see going forward. But anyway, he goes there, and Saul pursues him, avoiding the whole episode at Keilah. So there's nothing that happens to them for their association with David. Jonathan finds David, and the two reaffirm their covenant of peace with each other, as the text points out. The pages are sticking together here, sorry. In verse 15, verse 17. Do not fear, for the hand of Saul my father shall not find you. You shall be king over Israel, and I shall be next to you. Even my father Saul knows that. And so, clearly, whether through his ravings or, whatever means, again, Jonathan knows what the future holds. And so he embraces that, and it prepares himself to stand with David. Meanwhile, though, the inhabitants of Ziph do not prepare to stand with David, neither this time nor later on in the text. They reveal David's general location to Saul, who employs them to find out the exact spot. And it's interesting, you see Saul using this language in verse 21. Blessed are you of the Lord, for you have compassion on me. It's more wishful thinking than to think that he can actually confer the Lord's blessing on anyone, but he's giving the appearance of being someone who supports the Lord in his more private moments. Again, note that difference where you don't see him using the covenant name of the Lord like you see him using it here, and we'll point that out later. David escapes to the wilderness of Moan, and Saul closes the gap between them to the point where there's only a mountain between them at this point, before getting called off to battle the Philistines. And so that's where this particular pursuit ends. They name this mountain, or perhaps a notable rock that features at this mountain, the Rock of Escape, as the place to remember where he was able to get away from Saul, and where Saul was called away from him. The thing that causes me a little pause for thought here, I get these little moments, even though they're not necessarily related to the text. War with the Philistines means people fighting, and no doubt casualties, and certainly at the very least a negative experience for people involved. What they call what ends up being to them a rock of escape means war for somebody else. And maybe that adds a little context the next time you're going through something that's challenging or difficult, it may very well be that even as you find yourself facing difficulty, that somebody else is being blessed. There's an interesting little. I hadn't actually intended to do this, but even while I'm talking about it, it reminds me of something that I think I took a little screenshot of it, if I can find it right quick. Shouldn't do things off the cuff. But I've been telling you, I shared with you guys a little bit of Mark Twain over the email. I'm reading a different Mark Twain book at the moment, and there's something that he talks about relative to prayer in it. Here we go. So what's kind of interesting about this little journey that he's taking, that I'm now chasing a big rabbit here, but give me a break. It's late at night for me. He's on this. It's another one of these kind of autobiographical stories. I mean, it is autobiographical. You always wonder how much of it is made up with Mark Twain, but it's in the book Innocents Abroad, and it's about his trip that he takes to Europe into the Bible lands. He is traveling with a crew that, and this is what society is like in the 1800s. It's mind-boggling living in the 21st century to see how, unfortunately, far we've come away from this. But there are regular prayer meetings and song meetings as a part of this trip. Now, granted, they are going to the Bible lands, but still, I mean, that's just, it's a cruise, which is ultimately a pleasure cruise, and the Bible seems to be kind of woven into people's lives. But anyway, they're heading east at a time of the year when no one heads east because of the headwinds, and everybody, traffic usually is traveling the opposite way across the Atlantic. And he says, I'm going to start reading here. There were those among the unregenerated who attributed the unceasing headwinds to our distressing choir music. They're talking about the nightly singing that they do together. There were those who openly said that it was taking chances enough to leave such ghastly music going on, even when it was at its best. And so it's kind of just funny. But there were even grumblers at the prayers. The executive officer said the pilgrims had no charity. So why did they have no charity? There they are. This is a quote from him. There they are, down there every night at 8 bells, which is how they tell time on a ship, praying for fair winds, when they know as well as I do that this is the only ship going east at this time of year, but there's 1,000 coming west. What's a fair wind for us is a headwind to them. The Almighty's blowing a fair wind for 1,000 vessels, and this tribe wants him to turn it clear around so as to accommodate one. And she a steamship at that. So in other words, she doesn't really need to fight the headwinds because she's going under the power of steam. If it ain't good sense, it ain't good reason, it ain't good Christianity, it ain't common human charity, avast with such nonsense. And I include that just to say that sometimes when we don't view our misfortune in context, then there's sometimes some glaring things that others notice about the way we are viewing things. We don't want to ever be the kind of people who can't see, the hand of God at work, and can't interpret things. Anyway, that's like I said, a big rabbit chase, but I wanted to share that with you. 1 Samuel 24, David continues to be on the run, and David has the first opportunity to spare Saul. So David returns from battle to continue his pursuit of David. Saul goes to relieve himself in the very cave where David and his men are hiding. Must have been a big cave. So he, while he's doing his business, they're like, let's, there's this temptation to go out and kill him. But what David does instead is to cut off a bit of Saul's robe. And even that makes him feel guilty. So he sneaks up behind him, cuts off a piece of the robe, and then creeps back into the shadows. David expresses the reason for his guilt, which keeps his troops from taking action they want to, even though he doesn't. And again, why doesn't he want to? Because, as he says here, and you'll see this coming up over and over again, during this period of him being on the run. Verse number 6. The Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, to stretch out my hand against him, seeing that he is the anointed of the Lord. David has a really, really good attitude towards the position of authority. And there unfortunately is a pretty big contrast. We've talked about this a little before. I won't belabor this point, but there's a big contrast between David and modern Christians in democratic settings. We feel that the democratic process sometimes gives us the ability to speak. Our freedom of speech and our democratic process gives us the ability to speak about our opponents any way we would like, even when they're in power. And maybe we should learn from David that, again, when people are in positions of authority, that authority has been granted them by God, whether they, in our eyes, deserve it or not. And being that they are appointed by God, as Romans 13:1 and following teaches us, that we should treat them with due respect. And we talked about that a little bit, I remember, in the class that most of you missed. But as Saul leaves, David reveals himself, questioning Saul's pursuit and revealing that he had the opportunity to kill him. Here's the robe. I could have taken your life had I wanted to, but I will not do so. The Lord. The Lord would judge me for doing so, so wickedness proceeds from the wicked, and my hand has not done any wickedness towards you. He then speaks about himself very humbly, and again, you're going to see this once and again. Who do you pursue? A dead dog, a flea? I'm nothing. Why are you chasing after me? And then he reminds Saul about the Lord. Therefore, let the Lord be judge and judge between you and me, and see and plead my case, and deliver me out of your hand. So he puts the matter, and the Lord brings the Lord back into the picture, which is enough at this point to awake Saul, as we're going to see. But before seeing that, the one thing does pave the way for the other. We can bring the Lord into the conversation much more easily when we have a humble view of self. David is well aware. We don't want to look in the mirror and say, "You dead dog, you." That's not what we're getting at here. But we ought to be willing to be humbled in the eyes of people, so that the Lord can be magnified in us. And so I like David's example here. And certainly we see our Lord so often taking the position of the humble, and as he teaches throughout his new covenant, the Lord gives grace to those who are humble in various ways. So, weeping, Saul admits that David's right, and even that he knows what the future holds. David will be king. Now I know indeed that you shall surely be king. The kingdom of Israel will be established in your hand. He seeks mercy from David, and David swears it will be granted. And the two part at this point in peace. And so you think that's that, but it's not. In the meantime, when we get into chapter 25, any questions on chapter 24? I'm just kind of rolling along here. Yep. Chapter 25. I like, if you ask questions, then I see some of you like eating and stuff, and I'm like, oh man, that looks good. But anyway, chapter 25, there's an interlude here between David and a guy named Nabal. Samuel dies, and that's important to know for events that happen in the future, but also perhaps to explain why Saul reinvigorates the chase again. Because really, you have this interlude chapter, and then all of a sudden, Saul's back chasing again. Did something spur that about Samuel's death? You wonder about that kind of thing. David goes to the wilderness of Paran, and there lives in that area Nabal and Abigail, a total mismatch. The classic. Beauty and brains marries the brawn and not much else. Nabal is a coarse, harsh individual, and does not in any way match his wife. David sends some of his men to seek help and provisions from Nabal, and he has a reason to do this. Nabal's sheep have been out for shearing, and this is a day and time in which it is very, very common. Jesus talks about the thieves coming and stealing. It's very, very common for in this period, if that happened under the Romans' watchful eye, then what about in the days of the kings here? Like where we're not very far removed from everybody doing what they want to in Israel. Every man that was right in his own eyes. There is a king, but he's hardly, got the kingdom under his thumb, kind of thing. He's been protecting Nabal and his Nabal's shepherds and his sheep, and so he kind of expects kindness for kindness. Well, Nabal doesn't see it that way. He insults David, and then he refuses to help. Look, this day, that's reading on chapter 25, verse 10. Nabal answered David's servants and said, "Who is David? Who is the son of Jesse? There are many servants nowadays who break away, each one from his master. There's another runaway slave." And so that's a pretty big slight on David. And I'm not going to help him. Why should I give my food that I've gotten from my servants and give it to him? No way. Well, David finds out, and he is furious. He prepares to attack, take his troops and attack, this man and kill him and kill his family, all the men at least. Question: we're trying to read history critically. Does this reaction indicate a man after God's own heart?
No.
I'm gonna agree there, Joey. I don't think it does. This is more a man than a man after God's own heart. He is allowing his emotions to get the better of him here, and we see that happening at times in David. So realize that character faults don't come out of nowhere, and and again, even these heroes of faith had their darker moments. And so when we prepare ourselves to think about that, that'll help us with some of the things we see later.
It's interesting to see this essentially right after the kind of extreme pacifism that he takes towards Saul, and then this Nabal guy shows up, and things change a bit.
Yeah, and even though, looked at through one lens, David has helped Nabal, but the other
mercenary
lens,
work.
Yeah, but the other side of it is that Nabal didn't ask for that, one, and two, we're not very far removed from protection money at this point. The gangsters roll into your shop and we're gonna keep the bad guys off you if you help us out a little bit. So while it was perfectly in keeping with hospitality and the kind of things that happen in this day for David to have asked, it was also, although inhospitable and not in the heart of the law, it was not, it's not totally without reason for him to say, "No, I don't want to give you any food." Anyway. Meanwhile, Abigail finds out about all that has happened, and she is shocked at her husband's behavior. She prepares a meal and meets David and his troops as they are marching towards her house. And even as David is promising death to every man in Nabal's house. And so he's ready to kill not just Nabal, but every man. And so that again says, where he's at, prepared to kill them for a slight against him. Abigail offers to take the blame for Nabal, whose very name, some translations would have it like kind of make you think that this kid was named. And even some Hebrew dictionaries make you think, some of the older ones make you think, like if you look at Strong's or something, make you think that Nabal's very name means like dumb or something. No, even though it's not totally out of place for someone to have a very, very convenient name in the Old Testament, His name sounds like foolish, and that's just she's playing on the word there. You know, I can't think of an English example, but there are certain English names that do sound like other words that, and people that are unscrupulous can take advantage of that and but here, her doing that with good reason, like, my husband's a moron, just to try to pacify David at this point.
Or
And
Kyle Butt, who used to work at Apologetics Press. I was, I believe, 8 years old when I was in the office and saw that nameplate of the new guy up on the door.
yeah,
And 8-year-old boy seeing that, there
yeah,
was some stifled giggling going on, I have to say.
yeah, and I'm sure, unfortunately, I've never asked him, but it would be interesting to hear the story of having that name.
What's the etymology of that one? Did
Well,
no one down the line decide to maybe you wanted to shift it?
yeah,
Maybe something else, change the spelling. I don't know.
well, one wonders, I have been watching a little bit of cricket recently, and the English captain for at least the 2020 side is named Joss Butler, Buttler, and not Butler. Maybe it's a shortening of that, and maybe that's
Well,
originally the way it was
a
spelled.
butt was also a type of barrel, I believe, at one point. So it might have been, kind of a Cooper sort of equivalent.
Yeah,
But again, because of name, English changing over the years, what was innocuous becomes less so.
yeah, right. Anyway, now we're really chasing rabbits. We got Mark Twain. We've got Kyle, but let's move forward. Anyway, she offers further gifts, praise. David's anger subsides at this point as he sees the Lord working in Abigail, and so this is the commentary. Sometimes history will give you some form of commentary in the way of what happens or what a character says to let you know that, yeah, that wasn't good behavior earlier. David sees that, and so he says that. Chapter 25 and verse 32. David said to Abigail, "Blessed is the Lord God of Israel, who sent you this day to meet me. And blessed is your advice, and blessed are you, because you have kept me this day from coming to bloodshed and from avenging myself with my own hand. For indeed, as the Lord God of Israel lives, who has kept me back from hurting you, unless you had hurried and come to meet me, surely by morning light no males would have been left to Nabal." So he now sees that wasn't a good thing, and God sent you to keep me from doing that. Even in the Old Testament, they're aware that vengeance is supposed to be the Lord's domain. And emotion caused him to forget that. Nabal, meanwhile, again, I like the word meanwhile. I've used it a number of times, but Nabal is drunk at home. And when Abigail returns and told him what happened, he has something like a heart attack, like he's wakes up from his drunken stupor with a hangover, and then his heart becomes like a stone within him. His heart died within him, it says, when he hears, this is how much of a bore he is. How dare you be nice to the man that I didn't want to be nice to? And 10 days later, he's dead. So maybe it was like a heart attack or something like that. When David finds out, he is so struck with Abigail that he asks her to be his wife, and she agrees. Now, what we're finding out here is that we've got another thing about David to draw a couple of red flags. That we now have him married to Abigail. He's previously married to Michal. Granted, she's been given to somebody else with that kind of behavior that we see, like we saw with Samson, like, oh, well, you're gone, and so I gave her to somebody else. But still, legitimately, he's married to Michal. And now he's also married to Hinoam, which we don't know who she is, and then Abigail. And so he's got 3 wives, which is something that God said the kings would do. David is now, as we get to chapter 26, going to be on the run again. Remember, we have no intervening detail to say what changed other than that Samuel died. But we've got the Ziphites once again deciding that they're going to reveal David's movements And whether it's that, or whether it's Samuel being dead, or something inside of Saul, or whatever, he's back on the chase again, and he pursues David. David discovers where he is and sneaks into his camp with Abishai at night. Abishai is going to be one of his right-hand men. But David refuses once again to kill Saul, takes a spear, takes his water jug, and gets away. How did he get through all those troops? Sleeping. Somebody surely was watching or paying attention, would have woken up. Didn't he step on a branch or something? Well, it says in verse 12 that they were all asleep because of a deep sleep from the Lord. Clearly, God wanted it to play out this way. David calls out at daylight, not to Saul, but to Abner, another character that's going to feature in history going forward. He's, at this point, kind of like the right-hand man of Saul, Saul's bodyguard. He's going to become David's bodyguard later, but he calls out to Abner, how come you didn't protect Saul? Look, I came in and I got the spear, I got the jug. You should have been more on guard. That, wakes up Saul again. Is that David? Is it, is that your voice, my son, David? And David once again speaks to pacify him. The king of Israel has come to seek out a flea, in verse 20. And so, again, that humility, again, trying to diffuse the situation. Saul owns his sin, owns his foolishness. Verse 21, I have sinned. Return, my son David. I will harm you no more, because my life was precious in your eyes. And David says, okay, here's your spear back. Here's your jug back. Then you get this kind of little, what I'm going to call a mild admonishment. David's not just, letting this one slide totally here. Verse 23, may the Lord repay every man for his righteousness and his faithfulness, for the Lord delivered you into my hand today, but I will not stretch out my hand against the Lord's anointed. And indeed, as your life was valued much this day in my eyes, so let my life be valued in the eyes of the Lord, and let him deliver me out of all tribulation. So David's kind of like, I'm on the side of God here, and implying that what Saul has done is not. The two, at this point, part in peace, but that's not very convincing to David, as we're going to see. So, chapter 27, David is on the run again, and to the Philistines again. Though they parted seemingly on good terms, David's not very convinced about Saul at this point. He goes to Philistia. David returns to Achish, who he had been with before. He pretended to be insane and all of that. That going to Achish this time actually does seem to pacify Saul. Saul stops chasing David at this point, and maybe you could say, as the text will unfold, maybe he's got bigger fish to fry. But there is a period of time that passes while David is here in the Philistines with the Philistines. So maybe Saul's like, well, he's just going to be with them now, and that's okay. Achish gives David his own village to live in. Obviously, there's an understanding that David is a warrior, and he has his little, his army of troops, and so there's some respect going along with that. And he lives with him for, like I said, almost a year and a half. David, during this time, he goes on raids into Gentile territory, giving the spoil to Achish, while claiming that it came from Israel. So he's attacking the Geshurites, the Girzites, the Amalekites, but he's claiming that this has come from southern Judea or other places that are a part of Jews or Jewish affiliated areas. And so building up the confidence of the Philistines, but again, doing so through dishonesty. So here we have another one of those little moral ambiguities. What do we think about that? About David lying about, where he is getting this stuff from to gain the confidence of this Philistine king?
That's not right. You shouldn't lie.
Yeah. You were going to find, there are commentators and teachers who will justify all manner of behavior in historical texts, but I'm always going to try to play a straight bat, to borrow a cricket expression, which I know might go over the head of some here. But just I view these texts and I say, this is not the kind of behavior that, once again, if we wouldn't see it coming from the lips of Jesus, why do we try to justify it? If we can't see Jesus in this position doing what David is doing, then why is it okay? So that's just it's a simple way of looking at things. Maybe some would argue too simple, but that's the way I approach it. So, any other thoughts about that, or anything that you'd like to add? All right. Well, if you don't mind, very quickly, we'll get the last kind of, get one more chapter here and get ourselves poised for the battle, and then we'll kind of do that next time. So, 1 Samuel 28, Saul needs answers, but where is he going to find them? Well, he can't find them from the Lord. So David has so won Achish's confidence that he's convinced he's going to go to battle with him against Israel, and that's what the Philistines are gearing up to do. So if you will, if you'll go to battle with me, David, I'll make you one of my chief guardians forever. You're going to be my man from this point forward. And so everything's gearing up for conflict. Meanwhile, with Samuel gone, Saul is desperately seeking a word from the Lord. The Philistines are coming. The armies are gathering. What should I do? Where should I go? Who's going to help? What's going on? And he's getting nothing. The Lord is not answering him in any way. It says in verse 6, Saul inquired of the Lord. The Lord did not answer him either by dreams or by the Urim and the Thummim, which we talked about earlier. In other words, that kind of thing on the ephod of the priests. Or by the prophets. Nobody's answering or able to give Saul an answer from the Lord. So why is that? There comes a time when there really is no answer from the Lord, and the events as they unfold are the Lord's answer, as we're going to see. And it reminds us of the need to seek the Lord while he may be found and call upon him while he is near. Saul has consistently not cared enough about the Lord and has been pushing the Lord out of his life. And so, we can't be surprised if we push the Lord out of his life if he's not close enough to us in these moments where we need him. Well, Saul visits a spirit medium in disguise, evidently the same kind of things that we see happening today amongst some are happening in Saul's time. He's hoping to talk to a departed being. We don't know who that is yet. We'll find out soon. The medium sees this as a trap. Saul's been killing all of us. You're just trying to trap me. You're working for Saul. So Saul says, swears to the Lord, swears to to Yahweh, to the covenant name of the Lord, that he won't punish her, and he won't. Saul seeks Samuel, and Samuel arrives, revealing to the medium who Saul is. Now, we'll pause here and say, apart from this event, does this really happen? Is this really a spirit medium? Do spirits really come, and talk through her to people? And is this just, is this something that actually happens in the world?
I mean, it seems to have happened here.
Yeah.
Also, the woman seems a bit distressed that it's happening.
Yeah. So again, when history leaves you with ambiguity, you can use context clues to form a reasonable interpretation. So as you're reading forward, what you're going to note is that the woman is like shocked this is happening, and Saul is actually going to have to calm her down because she's afraid. And if this is like regular, if this is Monday at work for this woman with her seances or whatever they're called, like if this is typical stuff, she's not going to be afraid at this, and she's going to be used to this kind of thing happening. I think that the typical experience of this world and its connection to the Hadean, or the realm of Sheol, the Hadean realm or the realm of Sheol, is one of separation and division. Can we get a message back? The rich man asks, Abraham, so that I can warn my brothers about this. And, Abraham says, no, they have Moses and the prophets, hear them. You can look at the book of Ecclesiastes, and the affirmations made in the more reasoned part of the book, that the dead don't know what's happening under the sun. I think it's in Ecclesiastes chapter 9 where that statement is found. And so that's long after this sort of pivot in the book of Ecclesiastes towards a position of faith, and a statement that seems to be in keeping with other statements made in faith. So I don't think that this is a normal occurrence in any way, and that something truly exceptional has happened here, which has caught this woman off guard. And I think that's borne out by the context clues. Anyway, Saul calms the medium and learns that Samuel has come. Samuel wants to know why he's come, and Saul reveals it's the Lord's not answering me. I've got to talk to somebody. And Samuel's like, why do you need to talk to somebody? You already know what the Lord has said. And notice how when push comes to shove, where is Saul in relationship to his God? He does tellingly say God and not the Lord. And Samuel replies saying, the Lord, Yahweh, has already said what needs to be said here. You know what's going to happen. And furthermore, let me tell you what's going to happen. You're going to lose this battle. You and your sons are all going to die. And he does say that a little bit more euphemistically in verses 16 and 17. Verse 19, actually, excuse me, I think I have the wrong scripture reference there. But verse 19, moreover, the Lord will also deliver Israel with you into the hand of the Philistines, and tomorrow you and your sons will be with me. Not be with me in terms of the great gulf between the torments and paradise, but it be with me in terms of the Sheol, in terms of Hades, in terms of the realm of the dead. So Saul falls in shock at this point, and the woman likewise is very troubled. But nevertheless, she convinces Saul and his servants to eat, and then sends them away. And like Saul promised, no harm comes to this woman for doing something that the law of Moses even forbids in its attempt. So what makes this meal kind of significant? There's a couple things you could point out about it. One, it really becomes a sort of last meal for Saul. I don't know if it is his literal last meal or not, but it's kind of like that. But what makes it more significant is we're eating at the cup quite literally, or at the table quite literally, of demons. And from the standpoint of 1 Corinthians, if you remember 1 Corinthians chapter 10, Paul says that one can't eat at that table and attempt to eat at the table of the Lord. He's not at the Lord's table any longer in any way, shape, or form. And so what's coming to him, there's, he's more happy to be here than to be to seek any kind of deliverance or 11th hour repentance. Well, we're going to wrap up for tonight. It's gotten past the hour. What questions or comments do we have as we wrap up for this evening?
I think just one thing that kind of occurred to me as we're reading this last section here is that, as you said, Saul already had the message. God already told him, through the prophet, very plainly what the situation was and what the problem was. But Saul wants a different answer without changing his life. And he's so desperate to get that different answer that he's willing to go to anyone to get it, even to a literal necromancer. Which I think kind of lines up with what we see. People like, I don't like what I read in the Bible. I don't like, what I might have heard about that. So I'll go and until I find someone who's willing to tell me what I do want to hear as a message from God. And of course, since Saul ends up getting a true message from God, he ends up not liking that answer either, because God has not changed in the intervening time.
Yeah. Yep, and that explains, when you think about why is God not answering You know, he did this in the Judges too. Remember, do you really want to listen? Do you really want, you know, my help to be delivered? Do you want to manifest the kind of change that it's going to take to receive that help? You know, so the fruit of repentance is by no means there, and of course, in such a situation, the Lord will not respond. Yeah. So, well, let's go ahead and wrap up for this evening. Let's close out with a word of prayer. Our glorious and most holy Father, we thank you, Father, so much for the many things that we've been able to see and discuss tonight. We thank you that you have allowed us the opportunity to reflect upon these texts as observers, being able to learn from the good and the bad in them, rather than to be in the situation of the participants. We know that we can sometimes be overly harsh in our judgment of those who've come before us without being harsh enough on ourselves. So, Father, help us not to do that, and help us instead to learn where they have faltered and learn how we can be different in your sight. We pray that if we think about this last lesson especially, that you'll please help us to seek you while you can be found, and to not drive you away through our behavior, and certainly not to turn to answers other than the one that you will give us through your word. Help us, Father, to be humble before your word as David was humble before Saul, and help us, Father, to be people who can manifest the fruit of repentance and be open to your lead and to your guidance. And we offer this in Jesus' holy name. Amen. All right.
Thank you, Patrick.
No, thank you all.
Thanks.
Bye.